Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, it is great to see such a full house today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Scharf. I've been co-dean of the law school since 2013, so 11 years. And in all that time, this is one of my favorite lecture series. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Frank J. Battisti Memorial Lecture. This is one of the law school's most important lecture series, and we're proud that it carries Judge Battisti's name. Who is Judge Battisti? Well, he served on the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Ohio for 33 years. And during that time, he was the chief judge for most of those years. During his time on the bench, Judge Battisti handled a number of some of the most important cases of our time, including the long-running Cleveland school desegregation case. Also, some important Fair Housing Act litigation and lawsuits involving the location and operation of public housing in and around Cleveland. Although he was a graduate of another law school on the East Coast, the one we call the Case Western of Boston, yes, I'm talking about Harvard, Judge Battisti was a great friend of our law school. He hired quite a few of our graduates as his law clerks, and indeed, this lecture series came about largely because of the devotion of many of Judge Battisti's former law clerks who helped to endow the series. And I understand there are a couple of them here today. Will you raise your hand if you're a former Judge Battisti law clerk? 1, 2, 3. That is fantastic. Thank you guys for joining us and for all that you've done for this lecture. We have had an extraordinary array of distinguished lecturers in this series, both from the law and from other fields in which Judge Battisti had an abiding interest. Previous lecturers included such luminaries as Judges Leon Higginbotham, Nathaniel Jones, Solomon Oliver, and Jack Weinstein, and also legal scholars such as Lee Bollinger, Erwin I'm sorry, this is a friend of mine too. He would kill me for this. Chemerinsky, close. Justin Driver, Jamal Green, and Michael Klarman. And also legendary civil rights figures such as Julian Bond and our own Fred Gray, whose picture is right there on the wall. He, if you don't know, was the chief counsel to Martin Luther King Jr. during the entire civil rights movement. That's just to name a few of the legends who have been here to present this lecture. Now, to introduce today's Battisti lecturer, I am very pleased to present my faculty colleague, Jonathan Enton. Jonathan.
Thank you, Michael. Just a note on Fred Gray. Somebody reminded me this morning that today is the anniversary of the first day of the Selma to Montgomery voting rights march that took place after Bloody Sunday. And that march took place in significant part because Fred Gray filed a lawsuit that resulted in an order from Judge Frank Johnson requiring the state of Alabama not only to allow the march to proceed, but requiring the state to protect the marchers. So, okay, but let's bring ourselves back to where we are today. The nature and legitimacy of the administrative state has become an increasingly contentious subject of political and legal debate. Topics like the major questions doctrine, Chevron deference, and other forms of judicial deference to administrative agencies, the non-delegation doctrine, the scope of presidential power, particularly the president's authority to oversee and direct administrative agencies, the legitimacy of agency adjudication procedures, standing requirements, and the availability of private rights of action to enforce laws. They sound arcane, but in recent years, both the Supreme Court and lower federal courts have grappled with cases involving these issues. Indeed, this term at the Supreme Court, several such cases are pending. And issues like this have arisen at the state level as well, including here in Ohio. Our Battisti lecturer today is particularly well suited to help us think about some of these questions. Edward L. Rubin is the University Distinguished Professor of Law and Political Science at Vanderbilt University. He is a prolific and erudite scholar of administrative law, constitutional law, and legal theory. As dean of the Vanderbilt Law School, he promoted significant innovations in the curriculum. Before going to Vanderbilt, he taught at the University of Pennsylvania and the University of California at Berkeley. He has written or edited nearly a dozen books and is at work on yet another one that provides part of the basis for today's talk. And he has published scores of articles in leading law reviews and many book chapters. Professor Rubin will speak this afternoon on responsive democracy and administrative agencies. Professor Rubin?
Thank you very much, and thanks to Dean Scharf. Thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to give a lecture named after such a distinguished jurist. I appreciate greatly the opportunity, and I guess I'll talk for about 45 minutes and then leave time for some questions and comments so that all of you can help me with this book. What Jonathan was describing is indeed a set of very controversial matters of immediate concern, despite a somewhat arcane sound to them. But I'm going to actually be more arcane than that. And what I want to talk about is not those issues, although what I'll talk about is relevant to those issues, but rather to step back and talk about the nature of our democracy in general and its relationship to the administrative state. The question that might arise is, do we need another theory of democracy? I mean, there are a lot of them out there, and no matter what your political orientation or your personal inclinations, it's likely that there's one or more than one that you can choose from that would capture a lot of those concerns. But I want to take a somewhat different approach, and that is to talk about a theory of democracy that incorporates modern administrative government, that approaches the administrative state itself as a democratic institution. And the jumping off point for this is the fact that really theories of democracy rarely deal with the administrative state much at all. And to my mind, that's really a significant gap, because we have a predominantly administrative form of government. And so if you think about a theory of democracy that doesn't deal with that, it's really a type of alternative history. It's what would democracy be like in a different society than our own? And as some of you may know, alternative history is generally categorized as a branch of science fiction. And so there's a science fiction quality to the existing theories of democracy, and I want to present a more realistic one. Now, to the extent that theories of democracy deal with the administrative state, they generally regard it as some kind of hostile or forced or some kind of inconsistent approach that then needs to be coordinated with or controlled by the administrative state. There's just an assumption that there's a basic opposition between democracy and administration. That doesn't make sense, and there are at least two reasons for that. The first is that democracy and the administrative state emerge in the exact same place in the exact same time, and that is at the end of the 18th century. The easiest example of this is France. In France, you have starting in 1789, a revolution that ushers in, albeit temporarily, I'll say a little more about that, but a democratic regime. The same month, they wipe away the institutional structures of the Ancien regime and replace them with what is recognizable as a modern administrative system, which is to say, ministries organized around subject areas, treasury, defense, foreign affairs, and other topics like that. They replace the noble participants, the noblemen who had previously been the heads of the agencies, with Bavarian bureaucrats, people who are appointed on the basis of merit, usually experience at that point, but appointed on the basis of merit for whom their position is a vocation. That is to say, it's their job and it's their only job. And various other features of the administrative state. So that happens immediately at the same time. In the United States, we have a revolution, and for a while, there's during the Articles of Confederation, there's no administrative apparatus. In fact, there's no executive apparatus in the government. But then it becomes apparent that we really need one, and so we draft a new constitution. And that constitution, although it doesn't explicitly provide for the administrative state, is understood to create the conditions under which there would be one. And that's what the first Congress does immediately. It creates a Department of the Treasury, a Department of War, Post Office, a Department of State. Now, there's a somewhat delay because of American federalism and the relatively undeveloped nature of the central government before a full-blown administrative state develops. But the initiation of that occurs immediately at the same time or a decade, within a decade of the advent of democracy in the United States. England is a somewhat complicated case because they didn't have a revolution. The advent of democracy is gradual. But to the extent that you can find a particular turning point, it's probably the so-called constitutional crisis of 1782 to 83. And that's when the two dominant rivals, Charles Fox and Frederick North, joined together to form this very uneasy coalition government and take the crucial step, which is to say, appoint all the ministers themselves. So the ministers are no longer the king's ministers. They're now a government appointed by the prime ministers, sort of, at that time, which is North and Fox. George III hated Charles Fox. Understandable, since Charles Fox referred to him as Satan. So he hated the guy. So he desperately looked around for somebody who he could champion or endorse in the upcoming election. And he found a 24-year-old young man named William Pitt the Younger, and indeed succeeded in getting Pitt elected, thinking that now he had a friend as the prime ministership. What he had was a much more clever and effective politician than Fox or North. And over the following decade, Pitt essentially did what Fox and North had done immediately, which is to say, get rid of all the king's ministers and replace them with appointed officials who constituted a democratic government, a group of members of parliament answerable to the people. At the very same time, Pitt created a modern administrative state in England. He created an income tax. He reorganized the departments. He replaced most of the noblemen who owned their position as property with appointed officials who, again, were salaried and chosen on the basis of their credentials. Now, because he didn't have advantage of the revolution, and the noblemen had their positions as a matter of private property, he had to actually buy them out, sometimes for enormous sums, tens of millions of dollars in modern in modern money. But they did that because of the commitment to this same administrative model. And so what you have is this simultaneous advent of democracy and administrative government at the end of the 18th century. That suggests a more organic link between the two rather than the kind of antipathy or antimony that we ordinarily associate with that. The other reason to think that there's an organic relationship between democracy and the administrative state is it's simply implausible to think that a government that had these two opposing and inconsistent forces would be particularly stable. But democracies have been remarkably so in Britain, in the United States, at least for the time being, right? But that they have proven to be very stable forms of government. And it just doesn't seem likely that you would be able to get that stability from a government that was composed of competing and inconsistent parts. So that's the jumping off point for thinking about the relationship between democracy and administration. Now, democracy is defined in our modern society as a representative government, as a government which is run by people who, by officials who are chosen by the people. And I accept that only because it doesn't make sense to fight against ordinary language. Then you get some kind of even more arcane theory that doesn't correspond to people's understanding. So let's begin with that. A democracy is a government that is operated, run at the highest level by representatives of the people. Now, that immediately, though, gives us an important insight that distinguishes this approach from many other theories of democracy, because representative government is a historical development of Western society, and it's historically located in Western society. So if you want to talk about democracy in general as an abstraction, you would start off with ancient Greece, because that's where the term comes from, and our kind of continuing cultural fascination with ancient Greece leads us to think, oh, they must have had some kind of primal wisdom about this subject. The problem is that ancient Greek democracy was not representative. It simply doesn't fit our definition of democracy. What's remarkable, if you look at the one democratic government in ancient Greece that is well documented, which is Athens during the 4th century, what you see is it almost looks like they're trying to avoid representation as desperately as they possibly can. Now, I don't think they're actually doing that. I just don't think they have the concept. They just didn't have the notion of representation. To them, democracy meant something else. It meant governing and being governed in turn. And so that's why they chose their magistrates by lot and rotated them on a yearly basis. And there are various other features of Athenian democracy that I could talk about, but all of them avoided rather than embodied representation. And so, that suggests that we're not going to be very successful trying to come up with any sort of general abstract theory of democracy, but rather we have to look at the historical development of democracy in our own society, with the understanding that between ancient democracy and our own society, there was a gap of over 2,000 years. So it doesn't seem that there was any lineal connection between the two. Now, once we look at representation as the essence of democracy, something from an historical perspective, something else becomes clear. Representation is a device. It's not the essence of democracy. Representation has a long history by the end of the 18th century. In fact, it develops deep in the Middle Ages. In England, which is most relevant, it can be dated back to the reign of Henry III in the 13th century. And so the purpose of representative government back then was to enable the king to enact taxes that were outside of the standard feudal dues that he had a legal right to impose. He would have faced a revolt from the barons. In fact, King John did face a revolt from the barons when he tried to go outside those feudal dues, and they had to make a peace treaty. The peace treaty was called Magna Carta, and it lasted 3 months before both sides breached it and went back to war. So it didn't really resolve very much at all. But if you wanted to, the feudal dues didn't generate a whole lot of money. They didn't generate enough money to enable the monarchs to do what they were trying to do, which is create a centralized state. In other words, this is the state building process in Europe. In order to do that, they needed two things. They needed a bureaucracy, so they needed to pay people, many of them lawyers. And the other thing they needed to do is hire mercenaries to fight. You just couldn't fight a medieval war with the levy of knights that we think of romantically as being the body of a feudal army. A feudal army consisted of a bunch of guys in loincloths who carried knives or bows or something like that, and that's what they were really fighting with very often. So you needed money to do that, and you needed more money than you could get for feudal dues. And so the way they did that was a percentage of the value of chattels. But in order to do that, you needed the approval of the legislature, of the legislative body, and that's what Parliament originally was, and that's what the other legislative bodies or state bodies were in places like France or Spain. Now those became vestigial, but Britons survived and became more powerful for a variety of historical reasons. And at the end of the 18th century, when democratic movements took hold, they had in England that parliament to adapt to their own needs, which was to create a government that was directly responsive to the people. Now, why did they do that? What was the basis of that? The basis of that was an underlying transformation of society, something that was really basic and really ground level. And this was a shift, for a variety of historical reasons, but this was a shift from an older conception to a more modern conception of morality, behavior, the role of the individual in comparison to the role of the state, and indeed the metaphysical status of the individual. I've written a book about it. It's called Self, Stuff, and Society. But the basic notion is that it was a shift from a conception of people who were people's role as serving a higher purpose, to people's role as self-fulfillment, as fulfilling purposes that they defined for themselves. So the previous conception was that moral behavior consisted of trying to achieve salvation in the afterlife, and serving the state as a loyal subject of the state. And this was the morality, I call it the morality of higher purposes, that dominated the medieval period from, let's say, 1000 until these revolutions at the end of the 18th century. It was a particular way of thinking about society and about human beings in society. And gradually over the course of the 18th century, as a result of the Enlightenment and other forces, there was a shift to thinking of human beings as moral behavior, as self-fulfillment, as fulfilling your own goals as you yourself define them. And so the morality was that you should be free to find your own means of fulfillment, and you should be restricted, the prohibitory aspect of morality. You should be prohibited from interfering with other people's right of self-fulfillment. And you can see how liberty of conscience comes out of that mentality. You can see how a shift in sexual mores comes out of that, and a whole variety of other things that have become fixtures of our modern way of thinking Now, translated into government, it's a shift from the notion that the individual is serving the state to the idea that the state is serving the individual. That is to say that the purpose of the state is to facilitate people's self-fulfillment, to help them achieve their own goals, and to specifically be prohibited from interfering with their goals. And democracy becomes a modality of governance that is consistent with that basic underlying shift in the whole conception of governance and the whole conception of human beings. And so the idea now of a representative government, taking this mechanism of representation, which had historically been developed just as a way of enforcing the rights of the barons against the king, and turning it into a central element of the government, because it became a responsive government, a government that responded to the needs and desires of the people via the mechanism of election. And that became the highest level or policy-making level of the government, elected officials. And you see that in both parliamentary systems, where people vote for members of the legislature, and then the legislature chooses the chief executive, and in presidential systems like our own, where people choose the members of the legislature and independently choose the chief executive. And of course, any theory of modern democracy has to accommodate both those modalities of governance. Now, the second component of a modern democratic regime is administrative agencies. Because without administrative agencies, you will not have a responsive government. You will not have a government that responds to the needs and desires of the people. This is a product, to some extent, of just government in general, but it becomes much more necessary and much more central to government because of another development that happens at the same time and for related reasons. And this is still another revolution, the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, if you think about it in the abstract, you might think, well, it's based on science. Well, it's not. The scientific revolution of the 17th century discovered or represented a very important conceptual shift, which is that the world is basically a mechanical phenomenon. And human beings, our bodies, are a mechanical phenomenon. So Newton says that, the same force that makes objects drop to the ground keeps the Earth rotating around the sun, right? And William Harvey says, well, the blood is circulating through the body by hydraulic pressure, some kind of mechanical means. All of that is really, really important, but it doesn't affect your life very much, right? It doesn't matter why the sun, exactly the Earth revolves around the sun in terms of practical life, or even why blood circulates through the human body. The Industrial Revolution begins with pragmatic artisans who are developing machinery. And that process becomes more sophisticated when people realize that you can use the discoveries of science to, in fact, extend those machine developments and create increasingly sophisticated products. At that point, there is a disconnect between what people understand and what is being produced. If you go to a museum and you look at a carriage that was built in the 17th century, it'll take you about 15 minutes to figure out how that carriage works. You'll, after a while, realize how the brake is clamping down on the wheels, and you'll figure out how exactly you can turn the devices that you use to control the horses. These days, we travel around in cars. Even auto mechanics don't understand cars anymore, right? When you take your car in, the mechanic says, oh, I have to send this component to the factory. Because our basic components of our life have gotten so complex that we can't possibly understand them anymore. And this is a great plus. This has brought us almost semi-magical conveniences and equipment. Some of the stuff that we have now, medieval people wouldn't have dared to ascribe to a wizard, right? Like your cell phone, for example. So this has been a major development. But the cost of that is that we live in a world that we can't comprehend anymore, that we don't have any that ordinary people don't have direct access to. You need to spend a whole lifetime now in order to understand. It has to be your life's work to understand how a car works or how a cell phone works or understand medical procedures. And in fact, we don't even, it isn't even a matter now of going to medical school. You have to go to medical school, and then you have to do an internship, and then you have to do a residence. And these days, in order to reach the advancing edge of medical practice, you have to do 2 residences very often. ENT isn't good enough. You have to do pediatric ENT or something like that. So this has been the process of development. Now, interestingly, and I won't go through this in too much detail, but interestingly, what fueled that process, the motive force behind it, was very closely relied, or really grew out of this same notion of self-fulfillment. It was the idea that entrepreneurs wanted to develop, a whole group of entrepreneurs to develop, who wanted to satisfy consumer desires. The same thing commercially that was occurring politically. That is to say, the entrepreneurs, and you could think of their theorist, Adam Smith, the entrepreneurs wanted to respond to the desires of the people. So they said to the government, and they became a powerful force, they said, stop using this mercantile strategy of giving monopolies, royal monopolies, to favored people. Very similar to the way political governance looked in the pre-modern era. In fact, very often, what we would think of as a government agency was, in fact, a royally granted monopoly. That's why in England those positions, and it's true in France too, those positions were regarded as property because it was in effect a royal monopoly. So there were royal monopolies in political areas, there were royal monopolies in the economy. Now in political areas, those royal monopolies were gotten abolished by the democratic revolutions. In the economic area, they were abolished or sort of forced out by entrepreneurs. And what the entrepreneurs said is not, we want to be free to oppress our workers. I mean, that was the Marxist critique, but that's not what they were interested in doing. They were interested in making money. And what they said is, we don't want to be free. Enslave us to the consumer. What we want to do is satisfy consumer needs. And of course, that was a way of making money. And the more they satisfied those needs, and the more consumers were prospered as a result, the more money they made, and it became a self-reinforcing process. So that process fueled the development of increasingly sophisticated products and an increasingly technological society. So these are all forces that are joined to one another. But that development precludes our ability to govern ourselves by simply understanding what the choices are and making those choices. It can be done at the highest policy level. But as soon as you get to the machinery of governance, it has exceeded the ability of people to individually understand. And so what mechanism do you have now to provide for a government that responds to the needs and desires of the people? And the answer is specialized administrative agencies, staffed by people who spend their lives studying and being trained in whatever area it is, and that they're working in. And you see that that then becomes a different organizing principle for government. So when our framers drafted the Constitution, they created 3 functionally defined branches or institutions. that were each responsible for the entire range of government action. So, the high school civics formula, so you have the legislature that makes the law, and the judiciary that interprets the law, and the executive that enforces the law. They're acting in every area. That doesn't work in the modern world. So instead you have a completely different mode of organization, specialization in the subject area, and then in each area of specialization is something that drives anti-administrative people crazy, but it's real. In each area of specialization, you need to have all those functions: interpreting, making the law through regulations, interpreting the law through adjudication, enforcing the law through executive action, combined, because now you have a different concept of how you're dividing the government, not by function, but by subject area specialization. And that's because the accumulation and development of technical knowledge has gotten to the point that that is the only way that governance can be carried out. And this is even more basic than getting the right results, although getting the right results is important. A government administrator cannot even participate in the discourse of the area that they are trying to govern unless they have that training. It isn't even a matter of, let's say, if you're regulating pesticides, or you're regulating cars, or you're regulating airplane safety. It isn't even a matter of getting the right result. We want that, of course. But even before you get to that point, you can't even talk to automobile manufacturers, or pesticide manufacturers, or airline executives without having that level of training. It isn't even possible to intervene at all in those areas without this level of specialization. And that's what is the driving force behind the element of specialized administrative agencies as being an essential component of a government that we think of is defined as a democratic government. That is to say, that a government that satisfied that very basic underlying notion of responding to the needs and desires of the people whom it governs. Let me just, I guess we're getting close to the point where we should open it up. So let me just say just two final things about that. Obviously, to some extent, the ability of that government to be responsive depends on how those agencies are controlled. We want them to respond to people's needs, but they don't have a direct channel the way elected officials do to respond to those people's needs. But you see, you can't have elected officials doing this because we need that level of specialization. So what we have is policy direction coming from the elected officials. But that policy direction can only be very general. Elected officials cannot substantively control the agencies because they're just not going to have the necessary expertise to do that. And so we have to be much more sophisticated about the control mechanisms and the relationship between the elected officials and the agencies than we have been. And we have to think of it in democratic terms. Now, ironically, that means a shift away from what we now think of as democratic governance of administrative agencies. What we now think of, and the two terms that you see used all the time, transparency and accountability. We want administrative agencies to be transparent. We want them to be accountable to the people. Well, that's just exactly wrong. It comes from what elected officials. Yes, we want elected officials to be transparent, to tell the people what they're doing, and we want them to be accountable to the people. We use elections for that process. That doesn't work for administrative agencies. If you try it, and we are trying it, what do you get? You get special interest groups controlling that process, because only special interest groups will be able to figure out what the supposed transparency really means, and only they will be able to speak to the agency in some way that is meaningful. And furthermore, participation is itself a special expertise. You really have to know how to talk to an agency in order to influence it. And you only can do that if you spend your life doing it. That's your expertise. And that's why there are large buildings all over Washington, D.C., representing lobbying groups, where it's the Home Builders Association, or the Funeral Directors Association, or the energy industry, or anything else. Because that's their job, is to speak to know how to participate in the administrative process. And that's what you will get if you use the standards of transparency and accountability. So what should we have instead? What we should have instead is a greater reliance on expertise and a protection of expertise from that kind of interaction with the public, because it's not working. That's not what, we're not getting responsiveness out of it. The responsiveness comes from the expertise, comes from knowing how to regulate an area such that it will respond to the needs of and desires of people as discerned by people who understand that particular area. Now, we have an interesting sort of analogy to that, and that's from the judiciary, from courts. Courts depend on outside, on the litigants for all their information. In fact, they're not allowed to get information from any other source. This is a change from the Middle Ages, where the original common law juries went out and investigated things themselves and used their own personal knowledge. And we've moved to a system where the decision maker is not allowed to use his or her own personal knowledge. Instead, they have to get their knowledge from the litigants. But we work very hard to make sure that they're not influenced by the litigants. Rather, so many of our mechanisms of judicial procedure are designed to insulate them from influence. In other words, we want the information to come to them, but we don't want the litigants to be able to influence them. What we've got in the administrative system now is something the reverse, where a lot of influence is being exercised. So a shift that would be truly administrative would be to focus more on expertise and protect their expertise from that influence process. In other words, we still want them to get information from the regulated parties, but we don't want them to be influenced by the regulated parties. We want them to take direction from the elected politician and then use their expertise to figure out what it is that really will serve the interests of the populace. And so that's one sort of consequence. Maybe we get finally to something less arcane and more pragmatic. But that's one consequence of thinking of modern democracy in truly administrative terms. I have a little more to say, but maybe I'll just stop there and get some reactions.
Okay, Professor Rubin is happy to take questions. This program is being recorded. It may be being webcast, I'm not sure. But in any event, there is a microphone. Please wait for the mic so that your questions can be picked up.
Thank you. This is fantastic and thought-provoking. And I want to go to the last point that you've made about the effective functioning of the administrative state, and ask a little bit more about what makes you think that expertise will in and of itself lead to responsiveness. So two sort of thoughts about that. One is that the judiciary is dedicated to a principle, the principle of the rule of law and the principle of justice, that an administrative entity might not have a principle like that to fall back on. And the other is that the politicians who are guiding these administrative agencies may themselves be captured, whether they know they are or not. And so, what guarantee, if any, is there that administrators are more likely to be responsive to the populace than non-experts?
Yeah. So, first of all, on the point about representatives, that's true, but of course, that's built into our system. That is to say, they are responding to the populace, and to some extent, it's not exactly captured. It's really what they're all about. And the populace isn't always the wisest source, but that's what we have to live with. Let me just say one quick thing about that, which is sort of a digression. So Plato, who hated democracy, in fact, we have no one who speaks for Greek democracy from the ancient world. Everybody was an opponent. One of them, Plato, and he has a very interesting criticism of it. It's called the ship of state, something we still use. And what he says is, imagine you're on a ship, and there's a navigator steering the ship. Wouldn't it be ridiculous to have the passengers on the ship try to take over and steer the ship? Now that was based on Greek democracy, which was participatory. But that criticism can be translated into the modern world, which is that wouldn't it be ridiculous, Plato might say, to have the passengers vote for a navigator rather than having a navigator who is skilled. Now, the usual answer to that you get in political science is, well, but the basic direction of the ship, the place the ship is going, can't be determined by a navigator. That's just a technical person. You need some other decision-making mechanism, and that's wrong. That's taking Plato literally to think, well, it's an actual ship. Of course, he doesn't mean that the navigator is skilled in navigation. The navigator is a Platonic guardian. He or she, but typically he in Plato's terms, has a better sense of the common good, has a better sense of where the ship should go. And that's a formidable criticism of democracy. The response or the answer has to be, we want a responsive system. We have a deontological commitment to a system that's responsive through the electoral process, even though they sometimes get it wrong in our individual view, from the critical observer's view. So that is a feature of the electoral system. Now, when we get to the administrative system, what becomes responsive to people is when experts know what's good and bad, and in order for them to do that, they have to be, at a first cut, they have to be deeply knowledgeable about that. You cannot know whether a pesticide is poisonous or not, and you can't know whether a pesticide is going to be beneficial in terms of controlling whatever pest you're concerned with, unless you have spent your life studying it. And so expertise gives you the basis for getting the right answer. And then it's always subject to the political control, but within that, the whole notion of expertise is that you know what people want because it's the thing that our society determines to be a good, an advantageous thing. Now, one other point about that is it is very important for those experts to be in touch with the community that they're serving. And for, the criticism that you often get of expertise or of the administrator is, there are these myrmidons, these bureaucrats sitting alone in a room and making up rules that may be technically correct, but don't benefit people or don't connect with the real world. And that's just not expertise. That may be abstract knowledge, but expertise of a government official means being in contact with your community. And every area of governance has a community. Think about the most abstract, remote thing you can imagine as a product of an administrative agency, and that's the James Webb Telescope, right? That was produced by an administrative agency, by the way. Think about that in terms of competence. That's the most complicated piece of machinery ever built by human beings. And it's the product of an administrative agency. It's built by NASA. You might think, oh, it's looking at the stars. No, there's a community there. And the community are professional astronomers. They were the ones who indicated what research projects would be beneficial. And they are in constant contact with the agency. The agency is monitoring a very valuable resource, which is time on that telescope. And they're managing it in connection with a community. And if they didn't do it if they weren't in communication with that community, they wouldn't be doing their job.
Excuse me, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. I'm Laura Tartakov, and I honor Judge Battisti. I was one of his clerks. And I honor, you mentioned Plato, and I could not say, my gracious, Judge Battisti would have said, Aristotle taught his professor Plato, there is no philosopher king, and the humility. Truly, we had to study in college, freshman year, any good college, Aristotle's ethics, Aristotle's politics, his definitions, and truly, no philosopher king, no politics but the statesman. And ultimately, it is Plato who learns from Aristotle. And to this day, we have Aristotelians everywhere who take the heritage, the legacy of Aristotle very seriously and very alive today. So we thank you. But please, with all due respect, honoring Judge Battisti, remember Aristotle if you're going to mention Plato. And Plato learned from his student, and I here learn from my students. And many of my students are present in this room, and they know that I keep teaching because I learn from them. And I thank you, Professor. Yes, next, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can't help but try to bring it squarely to the current docket of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And obviously you alluded to it, or somebody alluded to it as you were being introduced, but do you have any any public position about the deference that has been shown to administrative agencies for the last 45 years and is in danger of being trashed by the current Supreme Court?
Yes. As it happens, I do.
What a surprise!
First of all, obviously, our current Supreme Court has a kind of anti-administrative bias. And I think ultimately we're going to look back on this court the way we look back on the substantive due process court, the Lochner Court. The Lochner Court was trying to stand in the way of progressive era legislation. And they didn't really stop it, but they sort of maybe created a certain amount of disruption for a third of a century, and ultimately brought scorn upon themselves for having engaged in that kind of enterprise. And I think this court will be looked at it the same way. They are resisting what is inevitable in this society, which is our reliance on expertise in administrative agencies. And I think they're just doing it on the basis of business elites. And I think we'll look back, as did the substantive due process court. I think we'll look back on it in the same way. Now, with respect to Chevron, Chevron is an enormously important case. To some extent, they can't overrule it. And the reason is that what made Chevron so basic is that it revealed something that everyone should have known but no one realized. And that is that the administrative agency is the first interpreter of the statute, because they have to interpret the statute in order to implement it. And no one quite realized this when the Administrative Procedure Act was drafted, which is why there's no language in the Administrative Procedure Act directed toward interpretation. It just didn't quite dawn on them because, again, they weren't thinking in truly administrative terms. It didn't quite dawn on them that the agency becomes the initial interpreter. That's the insight of Chevron. And it's only after that that they got to the point of deference by saying that that's what Congress intended when they assign primary responsibility for implementation to an administrative agency. That the agency interprets the statute, and you have to decide what your stance is toward that interpretation. Now, I don't know exactly how Loper Bright is going to come down. I know Gorsuch probably wants to write the opinion. I don't know whether if Roberts votes with the majority, Roberts might not let him do it. Roberts might write it himself in order to preserve a certain continuity. If Roberts writes it, he will probably move from Chevron deference to Skidmore deference, and that won't make much difference at all. I don't think it'll affect the basic contour of judicial decision making.
So you don't expect that Kagan will have the opportunity of writing the majority opinion?
No, I do not think so.
Which is
too bad
slapping the
because
face to expertise.
he has not only the best grasp of the of administrative law on the court, but also a real understanding of what it's of what it's trying to do. But I don't think I mean it'll have a cataclysmic effect on my course, but because I'm teaching Chevron for so long. But I don't think it's going to have a cataclysmic effect because the underlying insight is so basic that it's going to continue.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, since COVID, especially on social media, I've heard more arguments about how we have this insidious administrative state that's encroaching upon our freedoms by enacting policies with no input from the legislative process. An example of that being the vaccine mandate that OSHA tried to implement, right? People are arguing that we have sacrificed too much freedom to the experts that you've been referencing. So to what extent do you rebut the claim that administrative actions in response to modern phenomenon like COVID are undemocratic?
Yeah, that's very good. So first of all, the discourse is really interesting there. I mean, the weirdness of saying that not getting a vaccine that not only protects your health, but protects other people is a basic notion of liberty is really notable. And what's happened is that people who oppose administration have recruited the concept of liberty in order to oppose plausible and important regulatory programs. And this is something that is very standard among the sort of economic elites. So they talk about the liberty of an entrepreneur to decide on working conditions. Well, that's not liberty. You cannot define liberty as your ability to control other people. Then, you've made the term meaningless. Then I have a liberty to control other people's religion. Gee, I would like to live in a society where everyone had the same religion I do. So do I have a liberty interest in that? Well, you can see. And you can see how that's inconsistent with the notion of a morality of self-fulfillment. Because the whole point is to protect each person's pathway, each person's ability to fulfill themselves. And things that are reasonable regulatory measures are just not really properly conceived as liberty. An example from the course that I teach is putting on your seatbelt. When seatbelts first were, when seatbelt rules were first promulgated by the administrative agency, by National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, people objected to it, and they said, you're interfering with our liberty. Now everybody puts on their seatbelts. It's become, we have learned, and law is partially an educative process, and that's part of the notion that I want to develop as part of the concept of representation. It's an educative process, and we learn what we need to do in order to create the kind of society we want, partially through law. So that whole discourse of liberty is, I think, a kind of a false account. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people who don't like the kind of impositions that regulatory authorities impose, but that is the process of governance. People don't like to be taxed. People don't like to be told that they can't throw garbage on the streets. I mean, that's the nature of governance. It's only morally objectionable when it interferes with things that are genuinely liberty, and I would identify those as things that interfere with people's process of self-fulfillment. Things like choosing your intimate partner, or traveling where you want, or having your own beliefs about the supernatural. You know, those are things that are validly conceived as liberty because they're connected to our underlying morality of self-fulfillment.
Professor, thank you very much for joining us. So you make a very compelling argument for the importance of expertise in the administrative state. And so in light of that, I guess as a follow-on to the last couple of questions, what's your explanation for why we find ourselves in a political moment where expertise is under such dramatic attack?
That's a very good question. I think it's related to another aspect of that same sort of political instinct, which is that it takes a long time for people to acclimate themselves to change. A colleague of mine in the political science department, Larry Bartels, one of the leading experts on voter attitudes, says that a lot of modern conservatism is that people are just maxed out on change. There's been so much social change about LGBTQ rights, on race, on women's rights. I mean, for 2,000 years, women were denied access to the learned professions. And then over a period of, 2-3 years, that completely changed. And now there's no law school in the United States that would accept something less than, let's say, 45% women. That's a lot of social change for people to acclimate themselves to. And similarly, the regulatory state is relatively new and represents a new way of thinking about governance. And there's a lot of resistance to it. It's also fueled by, I think, economic elites who think they have something to gain by resisting regulation. I just can't resist making one point that comes from my course about which is focused on the automobile industry. General Motors became the greatest opponent of automobile safety regulation, and indeed of automobile regulation in general. And one of the businesses in the United States that was most opposed, that took the most aggressive stance against regulation of its industry. And what happened was that it developed a kind of mania about this that led them to misunderstand their own market, which the regulatory authority understood better than they did. People wanted safe cars. They wanted fuel-efficient cars. They even wanted non-polluting cars, even though that one doesn't affect their own personal interests. And so GM went bankrupt. They went bankrupt because they were failing to carry out that essential function that makes for economic success by entrepreneurs, namely enslaving yourself to the consumer, meeting the consumer's desire for self-fulfillment, however designed, the consumer's needs and desires. And it was that anti-regulatory mentality that led them astray. And so what you get is a kind of resistance, not only on the part of the average voter, but on the part of entrenched economic interests that fuels this kind of opposition. And sooner or later, I think, they will that dissipates as well. I'll give one other quick example. The airline industry in its early days was dominated by pilots. What did it take to be a pilot in the 1920s? You had to be a really risk-prone person. You had to be, a cowboy in order to fly planes in the 1920s. And so the first airline executives were adamantly opposed to regulation because that was their mentality. The next generation were people who had grown up with regulation and whose skills depended on knowing how to handle a regulatory environment. And that's the kind of people you have now. So it's a long process of social and economic education about, accommodating ourselves to the modern world. My kids, they don't even understand why anyone would be opposed to gay marriage. When they asked me about it, I said, well, yes, there's the Equal Protection Clause and there's the Depression. They said, what are you talking about? Why wouldn't they be able to get married? But, that's a process of social development.
Thank you very much. I think for those of you who would like to continue the conversation in a less formal way, there is a reception. Is it upstairs?
Yeah, Ben's place.
Upstairs in Ben's place, and President